everyone. Welcome to Hyperspace on Dark Matter Radio Network. I'm your host, Solaris BlueRaven. I want to thank everybody for tuning in this evening, and a special thank you to webmaster and producer Keith Rowland. And my special guest this evening is Charles Ostman. And Charles Ostman has 35 plus years experience in the fields of electronics, physics, materials science, computing, and various forms of applied AI and artificial life, including 8 years at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley, and Los Alamos National Laboratory. Primary focus was on specialized materials, including DSME, shape memory effect, metallic alloys, and various material systems with unique electronic and photonic properties. At Los Alamos, this experience was applied to work on the Antares Laser project, the world's largest, most powerful defense laser system successfully demonstrated at the time during the SDI Star Wars development program. Subsequent professional experience encompasses a diverse range of technical development projects at facilities including GTE Lenkurt, Integrated Automation, Litton Industries, Lucasfilms, Phoenix Laser Systems, Omni Scientific Instruments, NanoThinc, Raytheon, Fujitsu, Evolutionary Networks, and a variety of other technology-related companies and institutions. At NanoThinc, a private nanotechnology consulting group dating back to the early to mid-90s, he was the director of media development and also on the scientific advisory board. Charles Ostman was the co-founder of NanoSig and chair of the Nanoelectronics and Photonics Forum, an organization with the primary charter of facilitating investment in nanotechnology-related ventures, and senior consultant with the Strategic Synergy Group. He was also a senior fellow at the Institute for Global Futures, a consulting group which provides strategic research analysis, technical due diligence, and related technology-centric development services to Fortune 500 companies and institutions worldwide. He has been a longtime active member of the Millennium Project, an independent nonprofit global participatory futures research think tank of futurist scholars, business planners, and policymakers who work for international organizations, governments, corporations, NGOs, and universities. This organization publishes the annual State of the Future report and extensive data which serves to provide a dynamic platform for developing workable potential solution sets to address complex, interrelated challenges which affect the world and its populations. Charles also consulted with a technology development consortium, Fourth Venture, which focused on working with former Soviet Union military scientists in the context of providing opportunities to redirect this resource towards commercially viable technology projects in the United States of America via sponsorship from IPP, Initiative for Proliferation Prevention, and DOE, Department of Energy. And Charles has authored numerous technical papers and published articles targeting general interest, business development, and technology-centric audiences. He is currently Director of Special Projects at General Hydroponics. His websites are www.generalhydroponics.com and www.historianofthefuture.com. That's a mouthful right there. And please welcome Charles to the show this evening. Hi, Charles.
Hi there. I probably should have shortened that resume down a little bit.
No, that's okay. I enjoy reading it, actually. It's stellar.
It's fun hearing your rapid percussion attempt to articulate such. So
I'm trying,
There you go. It's okay. So here we are. By the way, I just couldn't help but notice when you were going over the IPP, or Initiative for Proliferation Prevention, which I did work with for a couple of years. And this was back in 2005 and 2006. And now I look, almost 10 years later, it's very, very sad, actually, to see what's been going on with Putin and the whole Crimea, Ukraine scenario. I mean, it's just sad. It's heartbreaking. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we have quite a large Eastern European community, not right here, but a bit north of here towards Sacramento, which is the capital of the state. And a lot of these folks, have very strong sort of passions about their particular orientations. Some are specifically from Ukraine. Some are, some are actually from Kiev. And then some are more of a Russian orientation. And even here, you have rather heated arguments and people, defending their particular vision of how they think things should be. And yet 10 years ago, that was not the case. It was really quite different. And there was very much a camaraderie. In fact, sort of a little short story. Since you mentioned I worked on the Antares Laser project, I didn't mention it, but that's what I was doing at Los Alamos. I was working on something called the Antares Laser, which was sort of like the real version of Star Wars. You may recall in the first Star Wars film that came out, they showed the Death Star, and there were these multiple laser beams that sort of combined to make one big beam that would then blow up a planet. Well, we weren't blowing up planets. Our mission, though, was to neutralize incoming MIRV warheads, or multiple reentry vehicle warheads. Mm-hmm. And we really did have a giant laser. I mean, this was the size of an office building, buried in the ground. And I won't go into all the technical stuff, but it was basically 36 beams of collimated laser light, which was sort of compressed into one beam. And the pulses were very short, a couple of femtoseconds, but I don't want to say for how long of a distance, but we were able to track incoming test warheads and, burn a hole through them. We were able to do that. So the whole point was that we weren't trying to build machines to kill people. We were hoping to build machines to neutralize other machines to prevent people from killing people. But the point I was hoping to get to was, many years later, when I was at this event, and I was actually in Philadelphia at this major conference that was part of the IPP program, part of my reason for being there and working with Fourth Venture was to look for potential projects of interest. And these are all former military scientists. These are people that came from the black labs, the places that were not on a map, but where they were there for many years. And there were hundreds of thousands of these people, and many of them with PhDs. And these are extremely intelligent, very well educated, and very surprisingly open to connecting with the outside world. And here I was on this giant, conference trade show kind of floor, 5,000 plus people milling around. And one of the projects that had already been sort of quite partially funded by DOE was a fantastically beautiful vertical vane wind turbine. It was actually designed for use in Afghanistan, which, is another whole story. But the point is, it was a wind turbine that could produce a really amazing amount of energy for the size, for the actual volumetric region of space it took up. And it could survive all kinds of extreme temperatures and exposure to dust and rocks and everything else in rapidly changing wind current directions. And you were mentioning you were having wind there in Colorado. Well, this is a wind turbine designed for that kind of environment. Anyway, the three people who designed this thing were the primary warhead designers that came from the Makiyev State Rocket Facility, which was the number one place from where these MIRV warheads came from. And when I mentioned the Antares Laser project, they knew what it was. But the fun part was we all shook hands, and I didn't speak Russian, of course, but they had this lovely translator there who was, by the way, from Ukraine. And we all got along just fine, and they were the nicest people you could possibly meet. We had mutual respect for each other's situation at the time. We both felt a sense of, I don't know what you call patriotism, or for better choice of words. We were devoted to our cause. But the thing that struck me was that nobody there wanted to see anybody killed by anything. Their whole mission was to prevent us from doing something to them, and we were sort of in the same thing doing reverse. But that's what really struck me, was these were very decent, down-to-earth people. They had families. They had the very same kind of interest in life and saving the planets from some future dilemma that we did. And now, sadly, it's kind of like we've gone backwards. We see much more nationalistic fervor, much sharper dividing lines between what had been more of a homogenous kind of realm at one point. I don't know. I just make note of this kind of stuff. It's it's something. Forgive me for wandering off topic, but
no, you're fine. No, I agree with you. It's like the relationship has deteriorated without a doubt, and there is a lack of trust there. So what happened to the Antares?
Okay, so the Antares project was later declassified, and it became, in fact, one of the primary test platforms for fusion research. And even though it's probably out of date by today's standards, it was a very important milestone. It was actually the precursor for what later became the Shiva and Nova laser projects at Livermore Lab, which is actually, closer to here. The reason I was sent off to Los Alamos is because this was where that particular machinery was, and I had been working in photonics for a long time, so they said, okay, send them there. But actually, after the Cold War sort of died down, or at least the Reagan era died down, as it were, a lot of this technology was repurposed, and the primary goal was to go from weapons to fusion research, which I think is still a very valid and cogent thing to be looking at. Mm-hmm. In fact, this might be sort of a little side note to make note of. Lockheed Martin just released the first ever public sort of admission or suggestion, let's say, that they're developing a pickup truck-sized magnetic confinement fusion engine. Now, this is a big deal. Mm-hmm. I mean, for all the headlines that we see about, I don't know, miscellaneous, things happening in the media or political events and all this kind of background noise, the stuff that really should be interesting is completely almost unknown to the general public, although little bits of it sort of pop up once in a while. Mm-hmm. But when I saw this being publicly acknowledged by Lockheed Martin's own PR people saying, oh, yeah, by the way, we actually have this thing we're working on. So why is this relevant? Well, fusion, just to make a very simple explanation, essentially it's the same process you have in a star. You've got elements which are being broken apart and reformed into larger elements. And as that process goes along, energy is created or output from the reaction process. And the idea was, if one could do this and have a controlled, a hydrogen bomb, I guess is a better way to put this. A hydrogen bomb is essentially a star that only lasts for a few femtoseconds. It creates this gigantic fusion moment, and then it just blows up and dissipates. Whereas a fusion reactor is essentially a hydrogen bomb, but contained, and it continues on. That doesn't blow up; it just sort of processes and keeps producing more energy. And the reason this is relevant is because there's virtually very little radiation involved. Deuterium can be used as a fuel source, which is very common. Although H3, helium-3, which is on the moon, could be another source, and that's a whole other conversation. Mm-hmm. But the point is, there's lots of stuff we could use to feed a fusion engine. It would radically, and I do mean radically, change the whole energy footprint as we understand it to be in current terms. But the other piece of this puzzle is, and this gets a little more exotic, if one were to look at things like, for instance, gravity manipulation, time-space contortions, gravity wells in demand, that kind of thing, which I think is very much going to be in the future, if not already now. This is exactly the kind of power source that would be required to accommodate that kind of interest. And oddly enough, I was at Lockheed Martin in 2006. I was actually giving a talk on biological metaphors in computing, which we can probably talk about later. But they brought me there kind of as a sort of to provide an overview for trends, not exactly artificial intelligence, more like artificial life, but implied in an AI kind of context. But while I was there, this was a big event in Florida. It was kind of like their annual, I guess, executive management meeting or whatever. And so they bring speakers in to kind of throw up interesting topics. Okay, fine. So while I was there for 3 days at this lovely golf course place, I met a lot of the various engineering team management folks, one of whom, it really struck me right away. They had different people had different cards with different logos on them. And I recognized right away, this one group, they had the table of nuclides on their background motif for their logo. And I thought, well, wait a minute, that's interesting. Table of nuclides, by the way, it's kind of like the table of elements, only it's a more expanded version. It shows all the decay elements, or what are called daughter elements. When you have an isotope, is essentially an element where you have a mismatch between the protons and neutrons and nucleus, and the reason that it radiates is because it's spitting out both particles and electromagnetic waves until it finds equilibrium and falls into a stable form of a different element. So if one can chart out the different sub-elements that an isotope transitions through before it finally becomes the next element it's going to be, that's called the table of nuclides. Well, the reason that's relevant is because there's something called transmutation, which is the enterprise of converting a reference element of sort into a different element, sometimes synthetic elements. And it's a whole science wrapped around that. And why would that be interesting? Well, here's a reason. If one wanted to create things like antimatter, for instance, which would be a fantastic source for all kinds of energy-related questions, but also weapons for that matter, the first thing one would want to do is use a transmutation process to convert elements that are normal into something more exotic. And so here was a group that had this motif on their logo. And I said, well, by the way, are you guys working on transmutation? And they wouldn't say exactly what they were doing, but they sort of hinted around it. I knew enough physics to kind of get the gist of what they were trying to describe. Okay, so fine. So if you look at transmutation in the outside world, its real purpose had been, both in France and Japan, to take really nasty isotopes, like isotopes of cesium, for instance, and be able to essentially disassemble the nucleus of the atoms and then reassemble it to a more stable form so that you could create really horrible, nasty, hot leftovers into something that's more acceptable with less radiation signature. And it works. It's a viable process. Unfortunately, it's very expensive and takes really highly specialized equipment and people to operate this. So it's not really practical in a large scale sense. But if you want to make some really exotic, strange synthetic elements that might produce things like, antiprotons or whatever, yeah, it's a great way to get there. So you don't need much of it, by the way. So I was kind of fascinated that these folks actually had an entire department devoted to this kind of artificial element creation stuff. And then just more recently, like a couple of weeks ago, you see this little side note in one of the physics journals saying, oh, by the way, here's Lockheed Martin with their, pickup truck size fusion reactor. That's kind of a big deal. I mean, I'm just amazed that it's like, front page news. But I guess Kim Kardashian videos are more interesting than this. But,
I know.
But I mean, that's kind of the the reality of the moment. And so I circling back to this whole thing with Russia and Ukraine and all this stuff that's going on. It just saddens me to no end that we're like tantalizingly close to some really interesting thresholds of science and technology that might change a lot of the problems that are in the world, but the people are not kind of tracking along at the same pace that some of the technology is. And that was the point I was hoping to make.
Yeah, that's a good point you make right there. So what do you think of that Russian satellite that's up there right now that supposedly can disable other satellites or perhaps even hijack them? What do you think?
Oh, that's the tip of an iceberg.
Yeah, that's what I figure.
And I haven't worked directly with that sort of stuff, but I know about it. People I know personally actually have worked on that sort of thing. So the whole idea goes back to, again, the Star Wars days, kind of in the mid 80s. And some people I knew very personally, and we're still friends, they worked on something called Smart Pebbles and then Brilliant Pebbles. And these were it was kind of a simple idea, but it actually very effective. And basically we just have a satellite that could sort of independently be steerable to come up next to or near a satellite you're targeting, and then simply shoot little pebbles at it, essentially. I mean, if you're out in space and you have a small piece of anything moving at, say, 25, 30,000 miles an hour, basic physics tells you that apparent mass goes up to the square of velocity. So even a tiny thing the size of a marble or something moving at 20,000 miles an hour is going to make a big hole when it runs into something else. So these were kind of like smart rocks. I'm trying to come up with the right word for this, but it was a way to kind of like a slingshot or something, to like a high-speed slingshot. It's like throw things at an incoming or a nearby satellite, and it would cause a lot of harm. Okay, well, that was back then. Well, things have changed quite a bit since that time, as you can probably imagine.
Oh, yeah.
You may recall, this was almost 2 years ago now, China made a demonstration where they shot down they neutralized, let's say. They neutralized one of their older weather satellites to say, hey, look, we can do this. See, look what we got. So then, excuse me, about 2.5, 3 weeks later, we did the same thing with one of our satellites. Said, well, okay, you guys think you're hot stuff. Fine, look at this. And we, zapped one of ours. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. Just getting.
That's okay. Get some water if you need it.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I have some fluids here. Okay. So the point is, the fact that Russia would be sort of making their statement, as it were, they want to be one of the kids on the block, too. It's kind of like, in your schoolyard, and they got the big kids trying to show off he's the tougher guy or something like this. So it's the same kind of deal. They're just trying to show off, say, okay, look, we got one, too. But this is just the tip of an iceberg. The thing that's probably more interesting is the XB-37, which was this completely autonomous vehicle. It's called a lifting body. It's hard to explain this in a short amount of words, but basically it's a type of hypersonic space plane. And interestingly enough, once you get up to a certain altitude, lower orbital altitude, the whole dynamics of the physics of keeping something afloat or in orbit, as it were, the amount of energy required is actually quite small. As long as you get into the right orbital path and you can sort of manipulate the trajectory as you need to. So they had this thing up there for about a year, and they didn't publish anything about it. It looks kind of like a miniature space shuttle, actually. But it, sent it up there, flew by itself for about a year, and then, landed by itself, no piloting whatsoever. It just, came back down to Van Amberg Air Force Base and, landed. So that's like one of a handful of these kinds of projects that are ongoing.
Right. Can I ask you real quick? You said that's remote controlled?
Yes.
Okay.
It's both. It's autonomous, and in other words, there's no pilot whatsoever, but we can communicate with this thing anytime. But it also has its own sort of autonomous AI mechanisms as well. It'll sort of keep doing its thing until we tell it to do something else. And so the whole idea of autonomous vehicles, autonomous pilotable platforms, etc., it goes way beyond Google Car. Right. Put it that way. That's the least of the things that are going on. So.
Pretty fascinating. So do you think there might be a defense satellite of some kind on the moon?
I think it's possible. Let me get some fluids.
Okay.
I live in a farming area, so we have a lot of dust in the air. Hold on. What's that?
Okay. You need an ionizer.
Yes, probably so. I'm still a biological entity. I haven't quite, converted to a complete robotic yet.
You mean you're not like me?
Yeah, right, exactly. Our various cybernetic components can be interchanged. Okay. That'd be kind of fun, actually. But okay, so Halloween idea for the future. Anyway, so I'm sorry, you were asking about what again?
No, I was just wondering if you think there might be some kind of a defense satellite on the moon, a dish of some kind.
I wouldn't be surprised if there was. Now, I will say this much, that China's very aggressive space program is almost 100% military. They're very, very quiet about it. And, we gather information from what we learned through our direct observation and maybe some intel as well. But they're very aggressive about they want to put something on the moon, whether it be outright weaponry or at the very least, surveillance equipment, that sort of thing. I mean, it's a known target. I mean, everybody who's capable of doing something, they want to be there. Mm-hmm. Whether or not we've actually put something there, that may be an open question, but clearly it is a target. There's no question.
Yeah, it looks like, it's the ultimate eye in the sky, if you ask me.
Well, it's also not just the ultimate eye in the sky, but there's a sort of a secondary or parallel path here. I would suggest to you that one of the real looming things on the horizon that a lot of people don't pay attention to, but they probably should, most of the stuff that you're surrounded with, all your fancy computers and smartphones and tablets and all the technology sort of flotsam and jetsam that's part of daily life these days, would not exist if there were not various strategic minerals, and many of them are quite rare actually, that make these things possible. I mean, I used to be a chip designer. I used to design semiconductor devices, and to this very day, I still work with exotic lighting systems, lasers, and that kind of thing. And a lot of this utilizes very specialized materials to make these things possible. And virtually every circuit board, every integrated circuit, every optical device, all your fiber optic stuff has, strange elements like erbium and other, photoreactive elements embedded in their systems. Whether it's photonics or semiconductors or even superconductors, that's the next thing around the corner. All this stuff requires very, very specialized rare elements, which kind of loops back to the Lockheed Martin transmutation stuff, by the way. Mm-hmm. That's a sort of a side note. But anyway, the point is our ability to dig these things out of the ground or perhaps refine them out of seawater, which is another whole agenda that's going on. There's various things that can be done to get at these precious minerals. Most often, or more often than not, they tend to be in politically sensitive areas. People have thought a lot about, blood diamonds or the sort of horrible situation that involves gemstones. So if we think that's bad, you should have a look at some of these strategic minerals. It's very equally the same kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Some of the most horrible wars and just really awful social scenarios are sort of wrapped around, various mineral sites. And China, by the way, again, they've been very aggressive about this. They've made they're not even shy about expressing their interest. They have a very big footprint in much of Africa. Mm-hmm. And of course they have a very big footprint in Southeast Asia. You probably know about their attempt to sort of dominate the entire South China Sea. Anywhere they can get their claws into an area and say, okay, we now have a presence here and tell us to go away, but we're going to be here with our military presence. And the number one driver for that is to access and to command control over these strategic minerals. And whoever has the vice grip on the flow of those minerals absolutely, without question, controls access to the technology that these minerals enable. Yeah. So the only other answer that makes any sense is to go into space. And as it turns out, the asteroid belt is full of all kinds of interesting minerals. I mean, there's lots of stuff out there. Right. So the most logical pathway would be to set up stations on the moon as a kind of a midway point, and then from there, launch your interactive craft that would go out to the asteroids, mine open and bring stuff back. That's actually a real plan. I mean, that's completely plausible. Whether or not we get that far, if we don't eradicate ourselves as a species on the planet before then, that could be an open question mark. But in theory, at least, that would be the next place to go and the next thing to do.
Right. So, and then there's the Black Space Program nobody talks about also, which is probably more than likely involved in that already. But I find that very interesting. So yeah, it all boils down to possible space mining and.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, one of the people, a lot of people have been sort of asking, well, why are we so obsessed with Afghanistan? And people talk about having a strategic leverage against Pakistan, which I understand we're kind of quasi-friends with India, and Pakistan and India, of course, have been rivals since the beginning of when they first split apart. And, it's a very complicated geopolitical sort of jigsaw puzzle, and we're threading our way through this, sort of multiple layers of, complexity. But the whole point is, some people would say, well, that's why we're in Afghanistan. We, forget Iraq. Afghanistan is the place to be because it's a central pivoting point that determines what's going to happen between India and Pakistan, South China, and all that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, that may not be exactly the whole story. The real story is the trillions, with a T, trillions of dollars worth of minerals hiding in those mountains. Afghanistan and the surrounding mountains, the high mountain areas of Kush and Pakistan, that whole area, That's one of the last remaining places on Earth that has not been mined out or exploited to its ultimate potential. And yet, from satellite data, and certainly from actual specimens that have been pulled directly from the ground, it's packed with minerals. I mean, all kinds of different things, many of which are almost irreplaceable even now. So if one had to come up with a kind of an explanation for why are we so bent on staying there, that might be an explanation.
Yeah,
before we ever go into space, this is the next thing we can get our hands on.
Right.
So again, it's just a little pice of a larger puzzle.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So what kind of minerals are we talking about again? Which are the ones that are so exotic that are necessary?
Yeah. Well, for instance, osmium, and it has nothing to do with my name, osmium has the highest melt point of any known element. Why is osmium relevant? Because if you're going to make spacecraft, rocket engines, and a lot of very, very specialized manufacturing platforms that require extremely high temperatures, you have to have osmium. Erbium is another example. Erbium is a photoreactive material. It's absolutely crucial in virtually all of your fiber optic communications because the way this works is you pump in a certain frequency of electromagnetic wave, a certain frequency of light, and then the erbium re-emits its own light at a different frequency, and this is extremely valuable for all sorts of optical systems that do with photonic logic, communication, that sort of thing. And there's actually a whole class of elements that are in the same column. On the periodic table, you see a cluster of these, and erbium is the most prevalent one, but there's a bunch of them that sort of connect in the same way. And then, of course, you have things like gallium and other materials that are used specifically for semiconductors. And they have things like palladium, which is absolutely valuable, more valuable than platinum, both of which are used for catalysis. And they're absolutely irreplaceable in many of your advanced chemistry processes. I mean, there's just a whole range of these things, any one of which, if they suddenly disappeared or became sequestered by a single nation state or by a single entity, it could change the world's economy. I mean, forget oil is a background noise compared to this stuff.
Yeah, so our technological evolution is based on these things?
Correct.
Wow, amazing. So how does this get incorporated into, say, artificial intelligence? What are these components? Any of these components go into the artificial intelligence design?
Well, yes and no. In fact, this is the very reason I was sent to Lockheed to discuss this very idea. And so here's kind of the general overview. It goes like this. If you go back in time to, say, the days of Marvin Minsky and sort of the early MIT AI lab stuff, that sort of thing, there was what's called weak AI. And what this means is artificial intelligence that's not really intelligence. It's dumb, actually, but it can mimic what looks like human behavior. And so a lot of your earlier bots and, things where there was one called LC, which is kind of famous, but there were a bunch of these where you could have a conversation and the LC bot would sort of talk back and forth and you could, have what looks like or sounds like sort of a quasi-humanoid type of interaction. And the same sort of fuzzy logic structure could also be applied to mechanical processes, things that might sort of learn on their own over time, repeated operations, they could become smarter at it, this sort of thing. But that kind of faded away, and something called strong AI has become much more the prevalent thing. And the theory behind strong AI is that you're actually trying to approach much more of a biological metaphor, biomimicry, if you will, but in a computing process. So that sort of opens the door up because you're not really limited by just using physical pieces of specialized silicon, as it were, to make these sort of unique kind of computing platforms work the way they do. People are actually looking at biological things to actually do the computing, not the least of which is using recombinative proteomics. DNA itself is actually being used as a computing platform for a whole variety of applications. But there's an entire sort of plethora of things where you sort of mix and match different kinds of materials platforms, for better choice of words. And this is kind of where the nanotech part comes in, because nature actually does provide a really interesting sort of potpourri of potentially viable molecular structures and material systems that if they were kind of rearranged in a specific kind of way, they could perform like a biological computing platform. And in fact, this has been done. So that was part of why I was there at Lockheed. And of course, many others are working in the same genre of interest. And you sort of see a bit of this now. I mean, all the stuff with these smart car, self-driving cars and the DARPA challenge where they had these vehicles. The first year the DARPA challenge happened, I think only one vehicle got as far as 100 yards. The rest of them didn't even get that far. But the next year, more than half of them completed the course. And now, of course, they've gone way beyond that point. But one of the major pieces of that puzzle was going outside the box of traditional quote-unquote weak AI and going much more strongly into sort of biological mimicry and computing. Mm-hmm. And the area that I kind of specialized in, at least for a little while, was something called evolutionary computing. That's the actual term for it. And I worked for a company called Evolutionary Networks, as you mentioned. So back then we were still using silicon chips, but there were other people who were beginning to look at proteomic systems, different kinds of proteomic platforms that could replicate what actually happens in natural systems. And this has gone much further than the average person might know about. So the idea is you now have a kind of a Pandora's box of different material platforms and also different, defined computing. Computing, people think in terms of ones and zeros and numbers and sort of logic equations. Well, actually, that's not really how nature works. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, we're sort of learning more about that kind of stuff. So is there a potential for kind of a quasi-biological neural network-like system that has both organic and non-organic components mixed together? Yes, that's absolutely where things are going. Mm-hmm. So that is one way of getting around the bottleneck of strategic minerals being a chokehold on this sort of development path. And that's, in fact, one of the reasons it's being so fervently followed. But again, to me, it's just kind of like a stopgap measure. I think there's a larger picture to all this.
Me too. Yeah.
And the other piece of this puzzle says, if we're being pressured, and I think we are in a certain way, to rely ever more on kind of machine intelligence to kind of run our daily life situation processes, you're seeing it now. I mean, it's not just smart cars; it's sort of smart everything. And people are going to be replaced. The whole idea of for better choice of words, kind of low-level labor-oriented jobs is going to become ever less relevant. Mm-hmm. You're going to see an ever higher dependency on absolute. If you think things are tightly wired together now in terms of most of your life is sort of in a virtual cloud as opposed to your physical life, it's going to become ever more so that way. But the flip side of that coin, though, is that also provides a fantastic exposure of fragility. In other words, if the network crashes all of a sudden, or if the clouds and gets dissipated, as it were, it means the end of life for a lot of people as we know it. So there's an extremely strong interest in coming up with ever more robust ways to make sure that no matter how badly a system might be damaged or hacked or however you want to put that, it can sort of repair itself. It has its own kind of self-awareness, as it were.
Right.
And so part of the topic that I went over when I was at Lockheed and also other places I've spoken at, I use the term synthetic sentience to kind of represent this concept. We saw the example, Skynet in the Terminator films. Well, that's not that far off.
We actually have a Skynet, don't we?
Yes, we do. Sadly,
hello.
And I, when I saw that, and I saw the company actually using that as their moniker, as their logo piece, I thought, wait a minute. I'm not sure that the PR people that advised them to go that direction. I'm not sure that was the best idea in the world. But anyway, the point is, the acceptance of a Skynet-like world is becoming the in vogue thing. In other words, what I'm hoping to say, I'm probably doing it rather clumsily, if you go back in the days of the early Terminator films, it was seen as a threat or something to be carefully looked at and very cautiously approached. Now, it's the exact opposite. It's like, oh, yes, we want to go there. We want to get everything hooked up to the a life-driven Skynet universe and have it all sort of morphed together into this one giant global organism. Well, okay, maybe. But as that process continues, the relevance of human connection to that becomes sort of less, if that makes sense. That's something I make note of. I just track this kind of thing.
It's actually very good. It's interconnected with the hive mind. I mean, when you start taking people, and I know this very well, interfacing them with the artificial intelligence design, you're interconnecting them at the hive level, and that can go in all different directions. And of course, they do weaponize a lot of this technology. But I'd like to see it used for good.
Hopefully so. To me, this is like an evolutionary challenge. Whether or not it is used for good or something not so good, in my humble opinion, I think this model has been followed on many. I very strongly believe that life is out there everywhere in the universe. In fact, it's a silly argument to suggest it's not. Mm-hmm. So one wants to follow that logic just a little bit. I would suggest that many worlds have probably gone through a development process somewhat like ours. They've got a humanoid or some other kind of life form that becomes quote unquote intelligent. Then given a bunch of millennia, they eventually become more organized and develop technology, and suddenly have this radical, almost like a vertical steep curve where all of a sudden all the technology begins to synergistically magnify itself and the world becomes rapidly overpopulated and sort of hit a certain plateau threshold. And at that moment, you have a bunch of different converging technologies which can either change the damage that's being done to the world and allow the entity in question to sort of progress to the next stage of development, or they implode and sort of, devolve, as it were, and then something else picks up millennia later. So we're kind of at that threshold as we speak. That's how I see it. Mm-hmm. So, whether or not we learn enough about what's going on to do this effectively, that could be a separate question. I think we were discussing earlier, off the air, about the idea that, as I see it, all the strife that you see in today's world, especially the religious fanatics, the ISIS and all that kind of nonsense, horrible as it is, as I interpret it, what you have really is part of the world is very much connected to the 21st century. They're here, they get it, they're trying to do their best to figure out what to do next. But then you have another chunk of the world, sprinkle around, which do not want to be in the 21st century. They really want to be in the 12th century. I mean, that's the world that they see. And in fact, they fear the modern world, and they will do anything in their power to destroy everything around them. And they believe in crazy religious, I don't care whether it's Christian fanatics or Muslim fanatics or any other fanatics, they have sort of a similar worldview. It doesn't matter if the world ends because they think they're going to go to heaven and have their virgins or whatever. And this is a very egregious kind of social pathology, which unfortunately has remained entrenched in very large segments of the population around the world. That's the thing that is going to kill us, not Skynet gone awry or something. I think it's the separation of time where
I agree.
Not everybody's in sync with the same pace of development. And I don't know if other worlds have figured out a way to go around this, but I would guess that this is the kind of thing that when they come to this event horizon threshold, as it were, that would be the major thing that is either the go or no go point, is how much synchronicity is there around the planet. Right. So that everybody sort of tracks in the same direction. And we're not really there. We're sort of sprinkled about in different directions. And
I agree. Yeah, where there's a lot of density here. And you're talking about entrainment. It's really brainwave entrainment, which is almost their own personal mind control program. It's their own personal programming that's actually becoming their own worst nightmare in the revolutionary, process. But what's interesting, you have to ask yourself, what sparks intellect? Is it a consciousness thing and the ability to access a higher dimensional realm of advanced consciousness? Because at some point in the continuum, there are people who get it and start advancing and start growing, like with the artificial intelligence or whatever in the advanced sciences. And then there's everybody else who doesn't even comprehend it or doesn't even want to. So what do you think sparks that type of knowledge?
In my opinion, I'm no specialist. There are other people who are vastly more educated than I'll ever be in this kind of area of interest. But as I see it, or my guess would be, at least how I've experienced it, is the curiosity to want to know more. Mm-hmm. And what I see in the religious fanatics or people that sort of fall into these very rigid, extremely narrow sort of mindsets, they don't want imagination. They're afraid of it. They want to be told from a book, from a sacred scroll or whatever the hell it is, these are the instructions. You must follow only these instructions. And if you dare to think outside this little tiny pinhole-sized, box area, you violated some sacred rule and to be sent to hell. I mean, there are people who actually want that. They're not driven by curiosity. And anybody that even shows an attempt at curiosity, they see as the heathen and they should be destroyed or whatever the hell. Mm-hmm. And quite often, I think what's really happening is you have a lot of people who are disenfranchised. They know quietly inside that they're really not part of the mainstream of the world's, ebb and flow and economic systems. And so they kind of cling to these sort of desperate, very archaic, millennia-old sort of religious paradigms because that's all they can relate to. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to admit to themselves, let alone their family or something, that they're simply failures in the real world. So they sort of retreat into these crazy religious paradigms. And sadly, I think that this is partly due to economics. It's partly due to extreme lack of education in some areas. And the power brokers that manipulate people who are so easily swayed by these simplistic religious paradigms take advantage of this. And their power base is reliant upon keeping their population base as stupid, I'm sorry to put it that way, but as stupid and as narrow-minded as possible. As long as they believe blindly in the fill-in-the-blank book of the moment, they'll follow whatever doctrine they proclaim. And the minute people start to think for themselves, they go, well, wait a minute, I'm not going to follow this path anymore. So there's a lot of folks who have vested interest in maintaining this mechanism. Right. But as I see it to be, I've always been, I'm a kind of a classic ADHD person. When I was a kid in school, I was always getting in trouble for not paying attention because I was bored out of my mind, basically. Yeah,
you're dealing with teachers that aren't even qualified to teach, probably.
Right, thank you. No, I think we share kind of similar.
We do.
So I mean, the point is, I was one of those restless type kids that was always a problem. But I left home when I was 15. So I mean, I was just bursting with the anticipation. I want to get out in the world. Whatever it is, I want to see it. I want to see it right now. I was very impatient that way, and still am probably. But the point is, to me, curiosity is the ultimate fuel that drives an interest in staying connected to everything that's around you. I mean, every time I go outside and I never stop thinking. It just, I'm always sort of there doing that. I don't know what turns that on or off. I really don't. There may be some genetic aspect to it. I just don't have an answer.
It's interaction with the universe and all different dimensional frequencies. And that's another thing I was going to get to, too. Dimensions, in my opinion, are based on frequencies and certain levels of consciousness. So, if you think about breaking orbit, say, with the Earth, say you're an astronaut and you break orbit with the Earth, wouldn't you think that once you break orbit with the programming and the collective, that the line of energy would be pure consciousness and that more inspiration would come?
I would offer this idea, and this is something to make note of. I've met 2 astronauts, actually 3, but I've met, Edgar Mitchell. I can't remember time right. Edgar Mitchell here at IONS, just a few miles south of here, who of course is one of the people that walked on the moon, and he came back profoundly changed. I mean, this was a guy who was very much an absolute do it by the numbers military test pilot type of guy who came back with this fantastic sort of spiritual awakening, and he wanted to bond with the cosmos, and he founded or co-founded IONS, which is the ultimate sort of place for science and spirituality research to continue on, et cetera. And then I met one of the other people who was actually, this was the guy, I met him at Lockheed, actually. This was the guy who, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name now. Russ Musgrave comes to mind, but I'm not sure that was him. But anyway, the point is, this was the guy who actually hand massaged the Hubble telescope because the Hubble telescope, the mirrors were not working correctly. They had to go there 3 times actually to sort of pull out the different camera components and reinstall them. And the Hubble telescope is way, way, way out into the extreme outer edge of like deep orbit. So it's a really complicated mission. And this guy's done it 3 times. So I talked to this guy. I mean, he was there, so we had a chat. Mm-hmm. And I was, again, struck by this was a guy who was an absolute do it by the numbers, as tight to the numbers as you can get. And yet he had this incredible cosmological vision of how we fit into the universe. I mean, this was the guy that you would never imagine saying this maybe 25 years ago, but clear. And the other evidence I've seen, the woman I was, the person who was my significant other for a number of years, we spent some time together. We're no longer together, but we traveled around quite a bit. So one of the places we traveled to was kind of like a bread and breakfast place. It was very nice and very fancy. We were staying in this place for a couple of days. And on the coffee table, there's this big book. And what it was, this came out quite a few years ago. It was a book that was poetry and kind of thoughts of the moment by both former Soviet and U.S. space, astronauts and cosmonauts. And every single page, every one, these were absolute hardcore military, right stuff kind of guys from both sides, both Soviet and U.S. Every page was like this incredibly rich, poetic vision of the cosmos, and we're just part of a larger system, and stuff you would never imagine coming out of these sort of ultra military super pilot type guys. So something happens when these folks go out into space and they come back. In fact, I remember I met Sally Ride before she passed away, which is very sad, and she died rather young actually from cancer. But I talked to her, same exact thing. She was very serious, absolutely brilliant PhD in physics person, but she had this kind of interesting twist on looking at how we fit into the cosmos. She even mentioned that she really felt something different when she actually saw the Earth from orbit and sort of got the whole picture at once and came back at it was an epiphanal moment. And she wasn't religious by any stretch, but she had this kind of spiritual way of looking at things. Mm-hmm. So something happens. I don't know exactly what it is. It may be a frequency shift, who knows, but something does happen when people get out into space and sense that we're just a little tiny grain of sand, this like cosmic beach, and then they come back and they go, I was there for a reason. I saw something that people here don't see. I must communicate this. I've seen it so ubiquitously. It's just, something does happen. So I can't explain exactly what it is, but I can tell you it's there.
Wow, that's awesome. An astronaut would be kind of one of the best things to be, if you ask me. That would be a cool job. But, to me, it sounds like an osmosis effect, interacting with a web of light. It's just something about a certain intelligence that's out there that's actually interconnected with the Earth that we are part of, that we probably don't have any interference, nothing running against us as we're, kind of outside the perimeters of the Earth itself. That's my intuition anyway. But very interesting. Yeah.
Well, I would also offer that, when we're here on the ground, we're permeated by electromagnetic energy of all different frequencies. I mean, everything from I have two cell, not one, but two cell towers within eyesight of here, and high tension power lines overhead and everything else. And in fact, it's extremely hard to find a place on the planet that's not inundated, not just with electromagnetic information, but also sound.
Right.
There was a German audio engineer that actually several years ago tried to find the remotest place on the planet, including Antarctica, and with all these high-tech audio gear, and no matter where he went, there was always a sound of something, a plane flying by or a ship, 50 miles away or whatever it was. So we live in a world now where our connection to the natural phenomena is completely clouded over by this haze of all this artificially created sort of noise, as it were. Mm-hmm. And I believe that our sensory systems are far more delicate and far more robust than just what the five senses, as we're taught, are feeding us. I think there's a whole another layer of quantum entanglement information, which we can get into later, I guess.
Yeah.
But the whole point is that if you leave the planet for a while and you're just out there, then all of a sudden all these antennae that you're sort of designed to have are open to receive the stuff that used to be more common here, but has been clouded over by this sort of synthetically contrived environment we're in. So that may be part of it. I'm certainly open to the idea.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. It's like a deprogramming that happens on some level. But we are bombarded with dirty electricity, you're right. To me, it's more like the grid in the movie Tron. It's just like this electronic grid, I mean, literally, that's what we're all interacting with from day to day. And it's just, it can be very toxic, I'm sure.
Is also not just the electromagnetic grid, but it's also kind of a social cognition grid that we're wired into. I mean, I'm surrounded by 3 computer screens, and I have smart gadgets sort of sitting in the corner beeping at me. Yep. And everybody I know has that stuff. And in fact, most of the people I know, I'm kind of a middle-aged guy, and most of the people I know have kids in college and that sort of thing. And some of the people I know, their kids are now having kids. And for the younger folks, like the tweens and the 12 and 13-year-olds, that sort of thing, they've never known a world that was not absolutely 100% online all the time, 24/7, 365. They don't even know what a world like this is like. If I tried to explain to them when I was their age, now I sound like grandpa now, when I was their age, and we didn't have 24/7 connection to everything, and we didn't have 3 different smartphones bleeping at the same time. No, we actually used books and pieces of paper, and we went to the library and used, actual cards,
right.
decimal system to look a book up. I try to explain this stuff to them, and they're like they just look with a blank stare, like, okay. Like I feel like Marco Polo, coming to a strange continent or something. So, and this is just in a less than a generation's worth of time. So that level of, I don't know what you call it, sort of cognition shift, for a better choice of words, is so radical. I mean, there's nothing to compare in previous historical reference that we know of. I mean, maybe there was at some point, but we certainly don't have evidence of it now.
Right.
But to have that scale of transition happen compressed in that short of a time frame, there's no way to measure this. There's nothing to compare with. And yet, if you look at people like, say, Dr. Bruce Lipton and others who have looked into this whole idea of behavioral epigenetics and that concept, and the fact that your thoughts and your presence, as it were, actually has a direct interaction with your physiochemistry and also your genetic makeup. I mean, there's actual real evidence for this. I mean, not to go off on a tangent, but you probably know this. I mean, Dr. Litton was excoriated harshly, very harshly. And this is a Harvard geneticist. I mean, it's the most qualified person on the planet to sort of speak on these things. And yet he persevered. He didn't let the academic pressure get to him. He just sort of went on his own and did these experiments. And now all of a sudden everybody else is going, yeah, well, look at this. And in fact, there's even a journal of behavioral epigenetics, and it's now a widely accepted science, but it certainly wasn't the case, say, 15 years ago. But the whole point was people have now replicated experiments in many different ways to show very specific hard evidence that given your sort of socio-anthropological environment that you're in, this will have a direct effect on your neurochemistry. It'll even affect how the DNA interacts and how it'll change certain potential mutagenetic mechanisms that occur. And within a single generation, these can be quite noticeable. So, I mean, we're like a giant Petri dish. We're about to find out, for better or for worse, what the outcome's going to be, but we're in the Petri dish as we speak. So how that changes the cognition potential of people in the future, I think there's a certain subset of the population that has adapted well to this. And in fact, they will become sort of the super intellects maybe of a future generation, the people that sort of adopt to this very well and actually have a much more robust sort of parallel processing capacity than a lot of other folks. But you're going to have a ever wider dividing line between the sort of select few that sort of genetically perhaps aim this direction, and then the rest of the planet who's sort of sinking further and further backwards. They're sort of retreating into sort of a more mundane time period. And it's kind of strange to watch that bifurcation happen. I mean, if I were to try to map this on a chart or draw a picture of this, it could throw some numbers on a chart and make some lines, but I mean, I can kind of see this happening. Mm-hmm. So again, as I was saying a few minutes ago, in my humble opinion, the potential success of our species to sort of adapt to this stuff and make use of it in a positive way really depends on the percentage of the population that can be in sync with this change or this morphology as it happens. Mm-hmm. And right now, that's still a pretty small number.
Right, I agree with that. Yeah, well, they're kind of calibrated for sure with the technology, but at the same time, I get this feeling that people are not using their minds anymore, and they're delegating their power to computers and things. Instead of using it as a resource for research or whatever, they're just kind of delegating their own intellect. They're not thinking for themselves anymore. So I think that's one of the kind of the downside to things.
That's a dichotomy. And in fact, just a spectacular example is, just since you brought that up, a lot of people, I'm not a pilot. I've flown a plane a few times, but I'm not a pilot by any stretch. But a lot of people I know out in this area are. It's a farm area. Everybody has a plane. So, and some of the folks I know actually fly very exotic planes. But anyway, so the point is, I hang out with pilots a lot. I sort of get a sense of what they do and how they train for it and that sort of thing. And one of the big deals is the high-tech jets and so forth especially have become so automated. There was a kind of a big crash out here not too long ago. It was a Korean jet that they sort of missed the runway. They came short. And they didn't kill everybody, but several people died, and it was kind of a bad thing. But the reason it crashed was because there were 3 pilots on board, co-pilot and another person was there. In fact, an instructor was on board. They were kind of training the new co-pilot. And they were so immersed in their instruments. And when the plane suddenly wasn't doing what it was supposed to be doing, and they had to sort of manually figure out what to do, and the runway was coming up in a hurry, and they were like, way too low, they didn't know what to do. They just kind of said, oh my gosh, the instruments are saying one thing, but we can look out the window and see that the ground is coming really fast. And they actually crashed into the rocks leading. The runway out in San Francisco kind of goes out into the bay. It's an artificial landmass. They put a bunch of rocks and stuff out there. And so they kind of hit where those rocks are. And it was pretty bad. They broke the plane up. And like I said, a handful of people died. I mean, most of them walked away, which I thought was amazing. But the point is, it was just like a graphic description of what you just sort of hinted at, where these were extremely intelligent, very well-trained people who, even in their rarefied universe, had become so accustomed to having the AI piloting system sort of tell them what to do that when it actually came time to do something different, like manually steer the plane, they weren't sure what to do. Mm-hmm. So an example of this has now translated into, believe it or not, NASA has been partially funding a project that involves, get this now, a direct neural interface to the piloting process of the plane. But here's what's interesting. In the training platforms, and they simulators are just like flying the plane, except they're inside of a simulation box, but everything is exactly 100% real. In fact, the entire machine sort of moves around. You can feel the G-forces of the thing goes back and forth and up and down and so on. So what the NASA version has done is they've inserted a neural interface so that if the pilot in training is spending too much of their time relying on the AI portion of the process, it will start shutting things off and force the pilot to manually take over. I mean, this is actually a program that's being developed because of this ultra-reliance on the sort of AI factors, that we might want to call it. And this is for pilots. These are some of the most highly trained people on the planet to operate some of the most complex machinery that exists. And so for them, for the FAA and for NASA to sort of come together and say, this is how we're going to do this in the future. We're going to have this neural interface so that we can track when the pilots are sort of getting bored or distracted or not really doing everything they should be doing. We're going to automatically start turning off the AI stuff and force them to kind of manually interact. That's a kind of a telling indicator. It's just like a little segue to say, well, so it really depends upon the person, and it depends upon who is driven by what kind of influence. In my own personal case, I'm sort of a fanatic for being curious about everything, but not everybody's the same way. I think a lot of people, even some of the really bright people I've met, some of the younger ones, they're under extreme pressure to succeed in school. They've got to pass the SATs. They've got to cram for the exam. They're worried about paying off the student debt before they're even halfway through school. There's real world pressures that are sort of grinding away at a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So they don't really have the luxury of kind of drifting about and being motivated by what interests them. They sort of have to grab the tools and sort of force feed the process to suit the momentary agenda, which is, how to survive, how to succeed in school, and whatever. So it's a kind of a weird mixture of things. It's not so much even that people are unable or even unwilling to maybe have a more diverse range of interests, but I think just the economic dynamics of what's currently going on has really forced a lot of people into a much narrower channel than perhaps it would otherwise be the case.
Yeah, well, I think science and spirituality need to be transcended, and I think we'd have a good, nice balance here on this world, if you ask me. But regarding that neural interface you were talking about, are you talking about a pilot with a type of helmet that interfaces onto the artificial intelligence?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Well, I think they probably used me for one of those because I don't need a helmet. But I've been through that program. I understand that program well.
That's I can understand. Just as a little side note along those lines, there's two companies you might sort of want to have a quick look at. Mm-hmm. One of them was a company called NeuroSky, and I actually met the founders of the company.
Oh, right.
It was actually a pair of Russian scientists. Same thing like I was explaining a few months ago about the IPPs. I didn't meet these guys there, but I know their story a little bit. So these were, again, a couple of former Russian guys that came over to the U.S., and they got funded, and they launched this company called NeuroSky. And what NeuroSky is, they are the number one or number two producers now of sort of game interface systems that use direct neural interaction with the games. And in fact, there's something called the Computer Game Conference. It's a big event that happens every year in San Jose. And just in the last 2 or 3 years, what had been a really obscure, like a couple of little minor blips on the horizon, has now become like the main thing. This is like the next new thing is going to be neural interface everything. Mm-hmm. And the gaming industry is probably the number one sort of business sector that's really pushing this, and they're pushing it hard. I mean, it's going to be proliferating everywhere. But right. NeuroSky actually produces a whole collection of, you can just look it up online, NeuroSky, SKY.com, and you'll see they have developer kits and they have software programs you can buy. You can write your own software, and it's a very nice package. Then there's another company called Emotive, like their main competitors, and they actually produce a much higher end, more like a medical grade system that has multiple sensors and you can tailor it to suit various needs. Mm-hmm. But the whole point is that this has been commoditized as a product. It's not even a exotic science thing. It's something you can just buy and translate into whatever application you have in mind. And in fact, the example of this was I was on Kona in Hawaii a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, and I was just traveling with some friends, and we pulled into a Costco, the big box store, to pick up some food or whatever. And so walking around this giant box store on Kona, right, big, sort of like tourist place, and I just happened to wander by the toy section just for the heck of it, just sort of milling around. And they're in the toy section for like $50. You could buy and this was NeuroSky, by the way. This was NeuroSky's Star Wars trainer thing. And what it was, it's a little headset. You put this thing on, and there's a ball that floats up and down inside of a column. There's a little fan that spins around. The theory is that
you told me about this.
Yeah. So this is a toy like several years ago. Okay, so now there's much more advanced versions of this, and I can absolutely positively assure you that this is going to go into smart cars. It's going to go into all. By the way, there was, I think it was the university. I'm trying to remember. It was Pennsylvania, Penn State. I think it was. I'm trying to remember which one. It's one of the big Midwestern schools. But actually, in the Midwest, there's an enormous interest in drones. I mean, actually, for agricultural applications or anything else, like 80% of the drone market is for ag use, and we have a lot of them out here, as a matter of fact. But anyway, so in one of those big Midwestern schools, they demonstrated the world's first ever neural interfaced drone, and this was like 2 years ago. So, a handful of grad students and their professor and some other folks were there, and sure enough, the guy put on the headset and out flies the drone. He's literally thinking the commands to the drone as the drone flies around. Mm-hmm. Now, as you may recall, there was a film that came out with Clint Eastwood. Firefox, that's what it was. And in the film, Clint Eastwood's character has to sneak into this Soviet airbase and steal this supersonic plane and fly it away and take it back to the U.S. But one of the scenes in the movie is he gets into the plane, he's trying to turn the thing on, and he has to think in Russian to get the plane to even turn on, let alone fly it. And actually, that's not far off from the truth. That genre of technology is actually real. I mean,
right.
And the reason it was developed, by the way, the motivation was nothing cosmic or psychedelic. It had to do with just the G factors that a pilot encounters in a plane, which is quite a serious issue. And in fact, the performance of the plane far exceeds the pilot's capacity to withstand serious G-force changes.
Well,
And
Charles, we're gonna interrupt you just for a second here. We're gonna take a quick break. Everybody will be right back. Stay tuned. Dark Matter Radio Network. Welcome back, everybody, to Hyperspace on Dark Matter Radio Network. I'm your host, Solaris BlueRaven, and I'm here with my very special guest, Charles Ostman. And Charles, you with me?
I hope so.
Yay! Yeah.
I exist, therefore I might be. I don't know. I look in the mirror and ponder sometimes.
Your phase shifting in between worlds.
Yes, indeed.
I have that all the time.
I understand. World morphology. It's a perpetual process.
Yes. So we were talking about those video games. You know, there is a video game now. I think I posted it on Facebook where they take your blood every time you die. One of your characters dies.
Ooh, that's a little harsh.
Isn't that ridiculous?
Well, I don't know. It's more of a training mechanism. Let me throw another thought at you. There's a company that was just got launched called Thera. Oh, I have to look it up now. But this woman out here in Silicon Valley, she was actually a Stanford student who dropped out of school at the age of 19 because she wanted to start this company. And what the company does, and she's quite successful now. I mean, she's got a lot of support, and I actually like what she's doing. But what her focus is and what the mission of her company is to bring medicine to the average person, where you can have your blood sampled at a local Walgreens or whatever for $5, $10, maybe $15, depending on the kind of test, and you can sort of a la carte pick the test you need. In other words, this whole healthcare thing is, as I see, is a giant quagmire, and we can wander that debate if you wish, but I see the whole thing as like a giant house of cards about to collapse. So one of the solutions, or a potential solution, or at least one solution, would be to enable the average person to not have to go to the big giant hospital and go through 18 pages of insurance forms to get this one test for the whatever it is, but instead say, okay, I need to go to the local drugstore, pay my $20, and I get these tests for these 3 things that are in blood, and 24 hours later I get a printout or a digital thing on my phone. And that's exactly what she's trying to do. And apparently it's starting to be launched like right now. I mean, literally, so a couple of Walgreens there started like a test pilot thing. But I think the whole idea of being able to take oncology to the masses, testing blood, so the average everyday person with a very small amount of money can just say, okay, I just need to see what's going on, and then I can figure out if I'm going to find this particular medical regimen or some other regimen. I think the whole idea of transferring the sort of epicenter of medical sovereignty away from the giant institutions and more towards the average person, I think that's one of the real missing pieces of this sort of future morphology. It's just a piece of a puzzle, a very complicated puzzle. It's one of them. So I kind of like this idea of the fact that the average person can now have their own blood test and not have to pay a fortune for it. And plus they can, if they want to have multiple tests to verify, get a second opinion, then you can. It's not a big giant process you have to go through. So it's, since you mentioned blood testing, I thought.
No, that's a good point you make. Well, in the old days, you'd have a microscope and you could just kind of play with your own blood.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the pathologies that one encounters in today's blood is probably a little bit more complicated. It sounds kind of strange. I mean, I belong to a bunch of different focus groups, and there's something called Quorum, and a lot of folks blog on there. And so Quorum comes up with all these different questions, and then people voluntarily decide if they want to participate, and sometimes they do. So one of the questions that sort of popped up was, and this was kind of interesting, but a young person brought this up and said, well, we think of the Earth now being polluted and trashed and sort of overpopulated and all these environmental problems are going on. What if we could go back in time 300 years? Would that be a better thing to do? And, it was a fair question. I mean, they were serious, but a lot of people responded, of course, in various ways. And my response was, if you just look at medical science 300 years ago, no, thank you. But here's the flip side of that coin. Back in an earlier time, the diseases were pretty standard, and you could see and identify them if you know what to look for. You had these major epidemics. You had various types of influenza and cholera and all the usual, Rocky Mountain fever and all the usual stuff you could sort of identify and deal with antibiotics and so forth. Well, in today's world, things have gotten vastly more complicated. We have an astonishing array of weird chemistries in all of our food and water and air and everything else. And blood analysis now is a much more challenging thing to sort of deal with. And a lot of the diseases that were sort of taken care of maybe 50 years ago are not even really factors anymore. We have a whole different range of things the outcome, which for the most part is a variety of strange cancers, which never really existed before, but they do now. And so even though the tools to look at the blood say, okay, we can see the chemistries that are in there, it's a much more complicated sort of a jigsaw puzzle to sort through to figure out what chemistries are of interest and what to deal with them.
Right.
And as a little side note, by the way, a number of people I know are Chinese, and they go back and forth to China all the time. And we do a lot of communicating on Facebook. So one of the things that I've been sort of keeping track of is the disease sort of pathologies that are happening in China. This is kind of interesting because up until maybe 20, 25 years ago, the vast majority of ordinary everyday people in China lived in a more or less agrarian kind of world. They ate produce fresh from the farm, and it was kind of a lot of fish and dairy and stuff that just came right from the land. And it was a kind of a different world. Now, of course, it's completely changed. The vast majority of people are flooding into the cities. In fact, a lot of the farmland is being sort of destroyed or turned into more like industrial land. And people are now, for the first time, eating a lot of processed food, and a lot of fast food is really popular. And they're sort of turning to junk food junkies the way that we are here. And interestingly enough, the same pathologies, the same sort of cancers, various internal organ failures, liver disease, all kinds of things that correlate with the change of diet with this kind of sort of modern food ecology we live in. You see the exact same thing happening there. It's like a radical spike. You can just see it. The data is like glaringly obvious, and you can just follow the trend as the food base changed and the environment changed, and now they live in one of the smoggiest pollutants on the planet. And guess what? They have the exact same collection of diseases that we were witnessing, say 25, 30 years ago, only even more so and rising even faster. So, I mean, you have pretty strong data to kind of support this. How we deal with the data could be a separate question, but so I just find it sort of interesting that as the potential for testing for what's in your blood or other tissue samples for that matter become more sophisticated, but at the same time more accessible, knowing what to do with the results of the stuff you're testing for may be equally, it's like there's a complexity curve that kind of tracks along with the technology curve.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I think society in general is mutating. I think that we are just completely going into another design, whether it's through the AI or it's through pollution or contaminants or GMOs. I mean, we're constantly getting modified to some extent.
Yes, we are. And in fact, anthropologists that I've actually talked with in past times, when I used to live in Berkeley, I was literally like within walking distance of the UC campus. So I spent a lot of time there. I'm now in the middle of nowhere surrounded by vineyards, so I don't really do that much anymore. But I used to have, and in fact, that's the one thing I really miss about being in Berkeley was having that interaction on a constant basis. But amongst the different kinds of folks I'd hang out with were some of the anthropology folks that would sort of look at this exact thing, the sort of rate of change. And then there were geneticists that would sort of track along with it. And what's interesting is that one can take actual DNA samples from people from, say, 1,500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, back to the days of the Roman Empire or the Middle Ages of Europe, that kind of thing. And the DNA is different. We were a different kind of living entity than we are now. And then if you map that against the radical changes in the different kinds of cognition processes that we're dealing with, as I was mentioning in the previous hour, that in itself has a very specific sort of neurochemistry and by implication sort of genetic factor that adjusts along with the neurochemistry. So yes, we are absolutely mutating ourselves, and we're mutating ourselves at a rate faster than anything that's ever happened before. So I mean, I agree with you. Yeah. And the evidence strongly supports that.
Certainly seems that way. Well, as long as we don't become a zombie population, which is, of course is it's not too far fetched actually.
Well, the one thing that kind of got my attention was this stuff called bath salts. The sort of, not to get too far from the tangent here, but my opinion about the war on drugs, it's a really horrible nightmare. But one of these sort of outcomes of this war on drugs nonsense is this evolution of these sort of bath salt things. And what these are, the way that class 1 drugs are defined, it's a specific molecule or specific chemistry that, the drug enforcement folks say, okay, this is the new thing that we're going to make now a Schedule 3 or a Schedule 1 drug. Okay, fine. So the various underground labs that produce all this stuff, they just, move a couple atoms around or, do a minor molecular shift, and then they can sort of skirt around the particular regulation that covers that particular kind of drug. So a lot of the stuff's been called bath salts, or these, mystery powders. They come in a jar or a bottle, and people buy them on the internet all the time. And this, interestingly enough, may have been one of the real progenitors for these sort of zombie. There's been a number of cases where people have gone completely off the rails and literally have tried to eat other people. There was a case in Florida where this guy tried to eat the guy's face off, but there actually been a bunch of these. In fact, there was a case like this in San Francisco just a little while ago. Mm-hmm. And, really crazy behavior. I mean, like way off the grid, completely like bizarro, like Hollywood crazy zombie film behavior. Mm-hmm. And it's partly driven by these weird esoteric chemistries that are being produced by these labs that want to, sell these underground drugs that are not quite on the schedule yet. And it's kind of a strange catch-22. The more the drug enforcement folks try to, put a bigger sort of clamp on whatever the chemistry might be, the more crazy stuff these labs invent to get around it. And so you have these really horrible results, one aspect of which is the sort of zombification of a certain population base that goes to this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like The Walking Dead. Well, what comes to mind for me is that if they do start getting interfaced with artificial intelligence, I mean, the artificial intelligence can control the life cycle. So if they do, quote unquote, die, they can be resurrected through the AI. I know that sounds science fiction, but it's really
I don't know. There's a really fuzzy line here because I'll never forget when I might have mentioned the last time I was on the air with you. I don't recall if I mentioned this or not, but one of the things I did do back around about 2004, 2005, I went to Rockport, Maryland, and testified to the FDA. At the time, they called me and said, "Look, I'm not a medical doctor, but they said that's okay. You're a material science guy, so it's fine." So I flew out there, and the purpose of the presentation was to describe nanomaterials or sort of nanomedical developments. And I said, look, I'm not a doctor, but I do know something about certain material categories that are being adapted for potential medical use. So I'll give you what I know about that stuff. And the reason they had me there and what they explained was, I said, look, we're in a quandary because we have to determine some kind of new regulatory path to explain how to put these things in some kind of regulatory context. In other words, traditionally in the medical world, you have two very separate worlds. You have the world of chemistry, which is drugs, basically. Then you have the world of devices, machines, things like when you go in the hospital and you're plugged into a bunch of gadgets, they regulate that stuff. There's like two very separate worlds. Well, in the nano world, they're sort of mixed together and that's actually what's happening now. I mean, people are coming with very, very interesting and very esoteric kind of sort of nano and maybe micro scale things that are really like machines, but they're more like smart molecules. I mean, it's a very fuzzy gray zone. Mm-hmm. So they were attempting at that time to come up with a kind of a regulatory platform to define like a third type of regulatory space into which to put the sort of nano things. So I gave my talk, and I spent about 90 minutes giving this presentation, at the end of which I said, well, look, whatever you folks come up with in terms of a new regulatory platform, fine, that's your business. But I have to tell you from direct personal knowledge that whatever you dictate here is probably not going to matter that much because there's a bunch of other places around the world where people are pursuing the exact same thing, and they don't have the same regulatory compliancy standards, nor really want to. And the United States doesn't really have the authority to project its economic power as it once did. So you can pass all the rules you want here, and that's fine. But you may or may not be much in sync with what's happening in India or even back then in China, and certainly various parts of Europe and so forth that had a somewhat different view of how they should regulate things than what we do here. Mm-hmm. So that wasn't exactly the most politically correct thing to say, but it was the honest thing to say. And I think the reason they brought me in was because I'm not affiliated with any particular academic group. I'm not hired by some company. I'm not there with any particular agenda to defend. I was just saying, this is the stuff I'm aware of, and this is what I think you should do. So maybe that's why they called me. I don't know. That's kind of a strange moment, but there I was. So, but having made that statement, I think there's truth in that because we live now in a truly globalized, sort of realm. Mm-hmm. And regulations here may or may not have anything at all to do with something that's going on somewhere else. And so when people begin to ask questions about, zombies being brought back to life or cybernetic beings, sort of half organic, half machine, that, Terminator level stuff or whatever, it probably is going to be happening. And it's probably sooner rather than later. And it may not have anything whatsoever at all to do with something that might be politically acceptable here. It makes no difference. It's going to happen wherever it happens.
Right.
So the technology curve is actually a very different kind of curve than what you might see from a policy perspective. That's just how I see it.
Yeah, it makes sense. Well, androids are pretty popular in Japan. At least they're working on a lot of that, aren't they?
Oh, they certainly are. And in fact, the major reason is because, as you probably know, Japan has one of the lowest birth rates on the planet. In fact, they've gone to a negative birth rate. It's like less than one per family, as it were. And there's a lot of reasons for this. I mean, it's a long discussion. But, I mean, and Russia actually is going through a similar kind of problem. I mean, there's a lot of places in the world where people have have come to the realization that it no longer makes sense to raise 10 kids. You're not living on a farm somewhere. You're living in the city, or you're living a sort of cosmopolitan lifestyle. So maybe even just having one kid or possibly two at the most is kind of the norm. And that's another dividing line. You have two separate worlds. You have the world of the people who are kind of more attached to the modern world, where they tend to have smaller families or maybe even no families at all. Then you have the other people who are kind of still living on the land, many of whom are the same folks who are bound by religious beliefs, that kind of thing, who still insist on having 10-kid families. And that's yet another mechanism where you see two very radically divergent lines on a graph going in opposite directions. But having said that, in parts of the world where the birth rate is falling below 1, and Japan's like top of the list, they have to have robotics, because especially for caring for elderly folks and just for a lot of things where you had lots of extra people to sort of do sort of menial tasks. Well, there's no longer those people around, and we don't have the big extended families as you once did. And you don't really have the sort of social infrastructure that may have been common, say, a couple of generations ago. So it solves a very specific and very mundane but very practical sort of problem. Mm-hmm. So as an outcome of that, different side agendas pop up, like replacing workers with robots. Of course, that's top of the list, but there's a bunch of other ones. I mean, I don't think it's that far off at all, where you're going to see everything from taxi cabs to garbage collection to you come up with a basic menial task, and it's going to be some kind of AI thing rather than a human being.
Do you remember Johnny Cab in Total Recall?
Yes, I do. Absolutely.
No. Yeah,
and people laughed at that sort of stuff, but, I'm not laughing that much anymore.
No, I mean, it's just right around the corner without a doubt. Yeah,
exactly.
I agree with that. Well, they have the energetic companions, I guess you could call them, androids.
Well, not to delve into this too far, but the other piece of this puzzle, of course, is the sort of sex industry. And I'm not big on this kind of stuff at all. It's not my thing. But I've seen evidence of this. And one person who actually is a materials scientist that actually helped develop some of these sort of artificial skin materials, apparently some of the stuff that he worked on, he wasn't involved with stuff at all, but people are now using those kind of materials to make these extremely realistic, life-size dolls. And
programmable Barbies,
Yeah, no, they are, and they're life-sized, and they're right. like $10,000 things. These are not cheap. And I believe it or not, I swear this is true. There's I stumbled across this by accident. Actually, I was researching something else. I just happened to come across it. It was actually a blog site for guys that had got their sex doll, whatever you want to call it. And actually, a lot of these guys, you kind of feel sorry. They're mostly older men, kind of 60-ish or whatever. That's kind of my age. And for whatever reason, they hadn't really been connected with anybody for a number of years, and this was a solution that made sense for them. And okay, I'm not going to fault them for that. But what I found fascinating was they actually formed their own kind of like user group, I guess, for a better choice of words. That's a bad choice of words, perhaps. But it was kind of like a blog for these guys, and they would actually show off their dolls, and they even had conventions, not a convention, but they have meetings, like 8 or 10 of these guys would show up at once with their doll in tow and kind of show them off. And like a little club sort of thing. I thought, well, okay. But then when the film Her came out a few months ago, which I thought was a fantastic film, by the way, I recommend to anybody who's interested in this kind of stuff. And Joaquin Phoenix is a great actor. That's a side note. But I mean, it was pretty well done. I mean, it wasn't stupid. It wasn't hokey. It was a good attempt at trying to suggest what this might look like if we fast forward, say, 15, 20 years, where people, I mean, again, this is probably a delicate topic, especially maybe for the female side of the equation, but there's a lot of sense that the traditional sort of, I don't know, marriage is not even the right word, but just companionship thing is kind of going through its own morphology. The idea of lifelong partners and the woman dependent upon the guy to be the breadwinner, that's all kind of passé. I mean, that's clearly very much in the past. I mean, it's a very different world now. And many people are kind of in a much more independent kind of orientation. They kind of, things come into their life and then they fade away and something else comes in. It's a very different kind of transition moment than what it was even, even within our own parents' time. This would have been unthinkable in an earlier time.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so is the next thing around the corner going to be trying to finding the right kind of companionship for whatever set of conditions it satisfies more convenient, more automated, more like easier to deal with? Because for a lot of folks, and I understand this, forgive me if this goes off the rails here, but having relationships is kind of an exhausting process. You have to really kind of work at it.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I mean, you probably can relate with this. Okay, so and I've been through a few of them, and it's okay, and it's all good. Nothing bad about this. But I mean, for the amount of work it takes and the amount of focus it takes, for a lot of people, this is like way outside the sort of event horizon they can recognize. Mm-hmm. So if an easier option sort of became apparent or applicable, they would probably at least try it. I mean, I think that's kind of not that far out there, and a kind of a sort of intermediate step towards this is this whole sort of dating stuff online. And I've never done this. I have no connection to it, but a woman that I knew for a while and was kind of a friend for, we got intimate for a little bit, but she was a chief romance officer for what's it called? Oh God, it was Match.com. She was this was her business card had this title. It said chief romance officer for Match.com. It's when they first got started. It was like in the late 90s. And so I went to her office and kind of met the primary developers and sort of got a picture of what they were trying to do at the time. But the sort of logic that they explained, they were trying to, justify they had venture capital people who were funding them, and so they got this thing off the ground. But their pitch was kind of interesting. They said, look, we're stepping into an era where the traditional mechanisms for meeting people and interacting are just completely different, and we have to have a new kind of template for this process. So they became the number one, I don't even know whether they're out now, but at the time they were like the number one biggest dating thing on the planet. And it kind of is fascinating if you look at the numbers involved and the rate of numbers, the growth curves of these different sites. I mean, just by the sheer statistics of how these things operate, and this is kind of where the Google type folks come in because they analyze this kind of stuff on a constant basis. You can just kind of see it's a very clear map. You can see the data trail, and people are resorting to a very different kind of way to find their social nourishment, I guess, for a better choice of words, which is completely different than what it was a generation ago. So if one walked on this path a little further, could one extrapolate and say, well, maybe the AI piece of this puzzle or some kind of synthetic sentience, quasi-biological solution is kind of not that far off? I don't know. It's not that it may seem like a stretch now, but given another 20 years, I don't think it's that much of a stretch at all. It's just
Yeah, it's a strange world. It's progressing in a very, I don't know, man. It's almost like a strange sci-fi, if you ask me. But it's gone from mankind is almost becoming an obsolete kind of design, and then of course you have to look at the soul and the spirit, though. Now you have to look at, okay, so they have replacement models, they have artificial intelligence, we have androids, we have these energetic companions that we're creating. But what happens to the soul and the spirit? Because in relationships, there's spirituality,
yes,
and there's a connection at the soul level, which is, unless they simulate something like that, right?
Well, and this is where it gets very, very iffy. In fact, I'm giving a talk sort of about this a little bit. There's a term called quantum biology, which kind of goes into this realm of how quantum entanglement and biological systems interface, and there's a lot to be said for this. But a piece of that sort of picture is trying to answer what's called the hard question of consciousness. There was, in fact, at one time, I don't even know if it still exists, but there was an event at Tucson, at the University of Arizona in Tucson every year. It's called the Science of Consciousness Conference. And it was actually a really good thing. It was a lot of people very smart from all different walks of life, everything from shamans to very serious, like top-of-the-line neurogeneticists and everything in between. That was sort of come together to try to discuss, show experiments or show their version of what they thought consciousness might. It was actually a very serious and well put together event. The last one I went to, I think, was in 2004, if I remember correctly. And I haven't been really connected to these folks for a long time. But during the time it happened, it was actually quite something. It was probably the best collection of thinkers and actual scientists in this realm that one could hope to find in one spot at one time. So at these annual events, that was the primary thing, was the hard question of consciousness. How do we describe what it really is? Where is it? How do we connect to it or something? So even then, the last time I was there, this is really true, I met a woman who, it was a husband and wife team actually, and the husband wasn't there, but she was. These are both like biochemists, medical type biochemists. And she was actually trying to get a grant. And I don't know which government agency was supporting the grant, and she didn't say, but she was trying to put together a grant proposal to detect intent at a distance. In other words, if people going into an airport or going into a sensitive area like a shopping mall or something where they could, instead of using the usual sort of detection systems, could one sense the sort of neurokinetics, if you will, of thought, or sense if a person had bad intent in their mind, could there be a flag for this? And my focus at the time was, I said, yes, probably so, but I don't think the equipment's quite ready for it yet. And we had a long talk about this. And then later she called me a couple months later. So this was back 2004 when actual government money was being spent theoretically, on trying to support research projects that would sort of nibble at the edge of this stuff. And the reason I bring that up is because, in my opinion, and apparently the opinion of some others, if we are to try to identify what consciousness is or how it manifests, it's a guess on my part, but there's some evidence for us that it's not just because of a bunch of neurons connected together in this thing we call a brain or a bunch of neurochemistry processes going. There's some other layer that happens. There's another dimension set that connects with it. And it's in this sort of quantum realm. Mm-hmm. And so, oddly enough, it's not had anything to do with consciousness whatsoever, but completely the opposite world, the world of security and crypto stuff, cryptography, who have now adopted entangled photonics as their chosen platform of choice, as it were, mm-hmm. to implement the next sort of generation of ultra smart repairing, self-optimizing cryptography mechanisms using the sort of quantum photonics as one of their processes. So out of that world, ironically enough, one can extract from the research that has come out of that world and sort of reapply it in this direction. That's my personal passion, mm-hmm. actually. But I mean, the pieces of the puzzle come from really strange and unexpected places, but they are sort of coming together. So if one were to walk this path and say, okay, let's say we have cybernetically enhanced humanoids 2 generations from now, right now we have people with artificial limbs and artificial organs, and I was just reading a piece about the world's first ever attempt at a 3D printed artificial eye. I mean,
right. Yeah, I saw that too.
So I mean, this is moving very, very fast, and so the whole idea of defining what's a biological entity and what's not, it's very much becoming a gray zone. So at some point, does it become more convenient, let's say, for the rich and well-to-do, mm-hmm. to actually have a kind of an artificial skeletal system where the organs are sort of mapped into it, and the whole definition of what a living thing is, I think, is going to become very much an open question, at least for the select few that are able to do this. Mm-hmm. So in that context, where does the boundary of consciousness begin or end, or something in between? And I would speculate that it's going to be in this sort of quantum domain that the answer might lie, or at least a part of the answer. That's just how I see it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Go ahead.
But I'm sorry. But I see the biological containment vessel, this clump of cells that we walk around in, mm-hmm. as like a vessel. It's not really the origin place. It's more like a containment vessel mm-hmm. that consciousness sort of resides in for the time that we're here in this functioning contraption. Then when the contraption falls apart and dies, maybe it just fades out into a larger sort of cosmology and perhaps even comes back at some point. I don't know. This is sort of wild speculation. But I do sort of see that as a potential model. Mm-hmm. So for those folks that talk about uploading their consciousness into a supercomputer and then downloading to some other entity, right. There are folks that talk about this kind of stuff. I've met them. I've spent time with them.
Yeah, they can do that with brain templates. They can certainly take a template and interface it. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but the question has arisen, and I was one of those unpopular folks that would ask these tricky questions, because I've been to a number of these. They're called transhumanists. That's kind of the mm-hmm. generic name for them. So I've been to a bunch of these meetings, and I know some of these folks, and Max Moore is kind of a big name in this arena. But anyway, so I've had these folks for a while, and I usually ask the really embarrassing questions they don't want to answer. This is my nature. I kind of do that kind of stuff. So I said, well, listen, guys. Okay, so you can map your sort of neurological coordinates into some sort of a storage mechanism, a supercomputer, and translate it back out into some other receptacle, a quasi-living, sort of partially living thing that might look like a humanoid, but it's part machine, part organic, whatever it is. Who knows? But if you're not taking into account this sort of very subtle quantum domain aspect of it, mm-hmm. you may just have nothing more than a smart talking machine, but it's not really the same thing that was you when you were living inside this biological thing. Right. And at first, people would almost, throw me out of the room, but it wasn't exactly the most popular thing to come up with. But more recently, people have actually started talking about this. And that's another little piece of the sort of quantum interface puzzle that I find more acceptance now than was even, say, 3 or 4 years ago, but it's a quickly moving target.
Yep.
But I think that there's more to it than just dumping a data map of what your neurons happen to be configured by at some moment. There's something else to it. There's something that extends beyond this.
Yeah, I agree, because otherwise they just have a copy of the original host with programs and not memories, literally. So there's consciousness, there's cellular memory, which is associated with consciousness, in my opinion, higher self, oversoul, superconscious, spirituality, the great cosmic mind, whatever you want to define it as.
Yeah,
but there's something that's infinite, that's immortal, which is based on our celestial heritage and soul consciousness. And I don't believe that can be replicated, in my opinion.
It may not be replicatable. Maybe some portion of it can be kind of quasi-transfer from one to another, but I think you're somewhat correct. At least we don't know enough about it yet to even understand what it is we're trying to replicate. That might be a better way of looking at that.
Right.
Because, I mean, to me, it's kind of like the vision I would come up with is, imagine if you took one of these ultra high-tech, like a lot of people hear out these really fancy motorcycles. You know, you look at a motorcycle, like, okay, fine. But you think, if you look at it carefully, the machinery is unbelievable. I mean, the stuff that can be packed in this little tiny thing that can go 150 miles an hour, and it has, if you look at the way motorcycles are built, it's just the extreme epitome of the high end of mass manufacture meets very, very beautiful engineering, you know, just something that's like a work of art almost. Okay, well, imagine if you went back 150 years to the days of, I don't know, post-Civil War days or something, and suddenly this modern Kawasaki motorcycle just suddenly appeared out of the... People would look at this thing and try to understand even what it is, let alone figure out how to reverse engineer it. It would be completely... A few very, very bright thinkers might catch a little bit of it, but it would be a big challenge to even explain what it is. Okay, that's like a subset of a subset of trying to explain what this is. In other words, this is like having a multidimensional, you know, hyperdimensional spacecraft suddenly show up and say, okay, back engineer this thing. That's kind of the scale we're trying to deal with in terms of replicating, can we store us in something else? And that may be something that if we come across that evolutionary event horizon, whether or not even a small portion of the population is ready for that.
Oh, I don't think they are.
I mean, there might be a very select few, but this is like, you know, what it reminds me of actually, and you may be familiar with this. There was a film that came out called Forbidden Planet.
Oh, yeah, I love that film.
And it is a spectacular film.
Classic.
And most people, people I've met over the years, the people are old enough to remember it when it came out. They kind of think of, you know, Robbie the Robot or the Skin. What was I forget the actress's name, but she was like 16, the starlet who was in it. And they remember her and her little miniskirt and all that kind of stuff. Okay, fine, that's just completely silly background noise. But for the select few that sort of got the larger picture, it was really a fantastically interesting thing because the basic idea was the Krell, which is a type of plankton, by the way, but the Krell was a civilization that disappeared all of a sudden and it left behind this spectacular, just unbelievably, a fusion, like we were talking about in the first hour, you know, a fusion system, a star in a container, but buried underground, just 20 miles in all directions, this giant power facility. And what it was designed to do was enable people to, with their thoughts, dream of anything they could possibly imagine. Just whatever came to mind, it would materialize instantly. And this giant energy source would sort of run a nanofabrication process, and then you could just, like 3D printing, but on steroids, as it were, just manufacture whatever you want. Okay, well, the reason the Krell did this was because they felt that, and I can understand the reasoning, it's reasonable enough, that if they could free everybody from want, from coveting things, from harboring envy over somebody else's possessions, whatever it might be, if you could just have whatever you want, no matter what it is, you just, there it is. This would solve everything. People would have a new level of social awareness, and there'd be more harmony, and there'd be cosmological evolution to the next level, or whatever it was. Okay, fine. Except for one small detail they kind of didn't think about too much. And as you may recall, the ship's doctor in the film, you know, he comes in, he puts on the Krell headset, speaking of headsets, and he puts the thing on, he gets a brain boost, and he dies. He gets killed by the extreme of the experience. But as he's dying, he grabs the captain of the ship and says, "I know what killed them, ... It was monsters of the id." And what that meant was that the Krell had not realized that their inner subconscious, all these demons, these dark thoughts that everybody has, would come to life at the same. In other words, that everybody went online at the same time. This giant planetary scale, kind of like an ultimate internet system of sorts. Everybody went online, they plugged in, they put on their headsets, and everybody said, "Okay, I found wonderful things, all this stuff." But what they didn't realize was they could not filter out the dark side, their subconscious stuff, all their strange fantasies, whatever. And they were all killed, like almost instantly, by all these demons and creatures that were created by their dark side imagination. Yeah. Well, it's kind of a simplistic way of expressing the concept. Excuse me. But the concept actually holds merit. So in other words, if we're approaching a kind of a Forbidden Planet-like scenario somewhere in the not-too-distant future, and at least a select few have access to this kind of stuff, they may not even know what it is that may come out the other end of the process. Correct. That's the part that I find fascinating.
You're spot on. Yeah.
It's not so much what a bunch of people get together and say, okay, we're going to hatch this new thing, and we're going to be the new overlords of the planet because we can now do this magic thing. is that they may not even know what they're unleashing, which
Yep.
may be far worse than anything could possibly imagine. So but I thought this came out like in 1950, I believe. I mean, it was really a radical, way outside the box. I mean, for Hollywood to have actually produced this thing, for money to have spent on a film to express this level of complexity. And you have to also recall, this was right around, I think it was in 52 or 53, that Richard Feynman came out with this famous, there's a lot of room at the bottom, that was the beginning of nanotechnology, was when he made that statement. He was kind of the main physicist that promoted this concept. Mm-hmm. So you had this film coming out that sort of depicted this idea of consciousness and being able to sort of synthetically replicate consciousness that had some rather bad flaws. And then at the same time, you had Richard Feynman coming out saying, well, there's a stuff called nanotechnology. We might want to look at this because this is where this is kind of coming from. So, I mean, there was this moment in time, and I don't know what spurred that moment. I don't know if it was, some people speculated because we had some alien craft that, crashed at Roswell or something that inspired these kinds of thoughts. I don't know. I'm just, guessing here. But something happened that got a lot of very special people to kind of look at this idea and say, okay, let's get this out there and see what happens when people respond to it. And
right.
And it was like a test. It was like a test balloon being flown to see what happens. And
and it always is the similar thread. Is it's always about consciousness in the mind. It's always about that fabric which creates so many different multiple realities simultaneously. But you're right, because if people have a lot of internal demons, whether it's lower astral programming and imprinting, then it's going to materialize on some dimension. And I believe that maybe mankind, the reason he is not evolving to the level he needs to be is because of all this interference that he has created himself. They say mankind is his worst enemy. I tend to believe that.
Well, yes, and now a more extreme or obtuse way of looking at this, maybe it's a requirement. And I know this is going to sound a little dark, so forgive me, but it sort of seems to me that evolution, as I've said before when I've been on the air, it's kind of a trauma-induced process. It requires a certain scale of trauma to kind of force the system to respond and come back more robust, or it perishes in the process. Okay, fine. Well, if you want to take that model as kind of a potential way of looking at these dynamics, it may be required. A certain percentage of the population doesn't really make it. It sounds terrible, and I hope I can put it in a better frame of reference, but not everybody's probably going to fit well with whatever the next thing is. And, there's going to be a lot of attrition. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, I agree.
And, call it corrections or whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of models for this in previous times, and there's probably one coming around the corner. And so whether or not we self-induce the next correction episode, and I think that's quite possible, actually, whatever comes out the other side, okay, it may either ascend to a much better way of being, or it may become much more primitive and you have to start over from scratch. That may be part of the process. But again, as I was saying earlier, I think this is a model that's happening on a number of worlds, and this is not uncommon at all. And in fact, if we are being looked at or visited by somebody, and I think it's quite feasible that we are, this is probably why they'd be looking at us, because they've seen this process before. They know this history. It's a mundane topic as far as they're concerned. So they go, okay, here's these humanoids on Earth, and they've gone through the same crap we went through, 5,000 years ago or something. We know the pattern. We see it. We got it. Okay, fine. So this is a good time to send some probes in there and kind of just see what's happening, maybe interact in some way. Who knows? But, I could, from just a very mundane, logical perspective, I can completely understand why we'd be interesting at this point in time. Maybe not us momentarily interesting, but kind of the larger agenda of, okay, what's going to happen with this planet and where are they going? And is this problem 20, 30 years on the road, or something we can manage later? That kind of thing.
Right.
It's a very pragmatic way of looking at it. But so does the cost factor of the people use the term self-sustaining a lot, but sometimes in a mistaken way. And I'm saying this very gently and trying to not be unkind. But there's this somewhat misdirected vision that self-sustaining means you keep everything the way it is in perpetuity. That's not really what self-sustaining means, at least as I understand it. Self-sustaining means that whatever the ecosystem, whether it's a sociological system or an actual biological system or even a planetary scale system, whatever it is, whatever scale you want to reference to, it's the fact that the thing itself may have to go through really radical changes to evolve to the next thing, which may be really different than what it was before that change morphology occurred. In other words, self-sustaining does not mean staying in stasis or atrophying to a specific way or a specific kind of mechanism. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It means being able to perpetually adapt to whatever the new thing might be. That's how I see self-sustaining. That may be different than other people's definitions, but that's how I see it.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. It's a survival mechanism, adaptability for sure.
survival and theoretically, at least, the potential to improve or to become more effective at dealing with the new environment, whatever it is. And if it's a self-induced environment, it may be a good thing or a bad thing. But whatever it is, the thing in question has to evolve to fit the process of change has to itself be a correcting process as it goes along.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. What's your impression of cryonics? Would you consider that for yourself?
Not today.
You don't want to go in the freeze for a while?
No. I knew some people that did the Alcor thing, and I don't know. Now, there was a couple of other competitors, by the way. It was kind of its own little world. And there was another company, I don't honestly remember the name of it, but one of the houses I lived in Berkeley, this goes way back to like the late 70s, they had a truck that drove around. I think the slogan was self-extension through cryonic suspension. It actually was written in these large red letters on the side of the truck. And these guys were right across the street. This is up on not near Shasta Road. It's kind of, there's an area up there called Grizzly Peak. It's like a big park up there. So the houses were kind of nice up there. Anyway, so across the street from the house I was in, these guys would show up in their truck and they would drive around. They'd disappear for a few days at a time. Then they'd come back and, I don't even know where they kept their bodies or whatever, but they parked their truck there. But then one day everything disappeared. And it turns out that they went bankrupt and the property got foreclosed on. And, a bunch of people had bought space in their freezer or whatever, and they disappeared with the bodies. It was kind of like a weird scandal. So it was kind of a sort of a nefarious kind of realm. But the reality is this: look, I don't know enough about cryogenics versus human tissue. I'm not a medical person that knows the science that well, but from the general knowledge that I have of it, the amount of damage that is incurred when you subject people to liquid nitrogen temperature or below, it's horrendous. I mean, it's not just a minor alteration. It's a big deal. The cells get ruptured, and it's like you get over this gelatinous mass, what used to be a living thing. So can you thaw it out and reconstruct it to make it a living thing again? That's a real stretch. I'm far from being convinced on that one. Mm-hmm. Maybe 20, 30 years down the road or something, maybe sooner, who knows? But if there's some other way of putting a person in suspension, but just turning into a chunk of ice, a liquid nitro, no, probably not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point you make there. Well, I would consider maybe they would probably transfer something into an android body. That's my impression, but
My guess would be that the attempt is probably going to be more along the lines of upload into some kind of, not a traditional computer memory as we know it to be at this moment, but something much more like an actual neural network. And there are plenty of examples of this, by the way, currently being developed. Something of a neural network that has a capacity to store some percentage of the stuff that might have been there in the brain at the point in time, and then theoretically sort of reload that back into whatever containment vessel becomes available later, whether it's a living thing or not. That's kind of that's my personal opinion of how that trail might go, but that's just me.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. We're getting ready to wrap this up in about, plus or minus 15 minutes, but we didn't talk about your general hydroponics, and I do want to touch on that because we do this all the time. We always
we have so much fun, we forget what the actual topic is.
I know, but I do want to talk about this.
Sure, okay. So I this is a good topic because since we are evolving and changing the planet and everything else, this is a really good time to take a really close look at the most important thing that keeps us alive, and that is our food supply. I mean, gee whiz, what a concept. Okay, so I actually co-founded this company many, many years ago, and then I left and went off to do other things. So it's kind of a strange chain of events that sort of brings me back here. And the original person I founded was still here, and we're doing our stuff now. But the reason I'm so bent on this is because several things sort of parallel at the same time. As I see it, and I've done a fair amount of traveling, I've gone to many places, major inner city areas here in this country and elsewhere, and I see miles and miles of vacant lots, rooftops, buildings that are partially used or completely unused. And in many cases, you see, at the same time, depressed economies. I mean, I don't care what the official unemployment numbers are. That's a bunch of BS as far as I'm concerned. I think the numbers are radically different. And if you talk to anybody in the major cities, I'll tell you from personal knowledge. So the whole context, we were talking earlier about robotics replacing people and this kind of thing. I think the whole idea of big smokestack industries, big heavy metal kind of job sort of orientation, that's just fading away. It's not going to come back. We're evolving into a different kind of realm, and people that maybe from a generation or two ago had a very different vision of employment, of career, of ways of life, as it were, It's just not coming back. I'm sorry. You can romantically live in those days if you wish, but it's just not realistic. So what's a different way of looking at this sort of current scenario? Well, one of the key things I see as a pathway to unraveling this and maybe projecting in a much more positive way is a kind of a decentralized approach to agriculture. And people would maybe a number of years ago had kind of laughed at this idea. I'm not laughing anymore because there's quite a few projects that sort of prove this point. But the pathway to get at this idea of being able to convert areas of urban areas and even suburban areas into functioning farms, localized or what's called locavore sort of agroeconomy, that kind of thing, is very feasible if you go to hydroponics. And the reason is that you're no longer defined by the access to land. You're no longer defined by the amount of water it takes, because traditional irrigation takes an astonishing amount of water. People, I mean, here I am in California with the worst drought in California history. I can tell you a lot about this. I probably bore you to tears, but I mean, the numbers are astonishing when you look at the amount of water that disappears in what I think are, in many cases, just completely wasteful and unnecessary farming practices. But that's a sort of separate topic. And then the other issue, of course, is quality of nutrition. And this may seem like an esoteric topic, but actually it's not. Because if we're now sort of meandering into this sort of iffy world of Obamacare, and we all know that the cost of healthcare itself is becoming just horrendous. It's next to education. It's like the number one downward driver for most economies. And for many ordinary average people, the working folks that have a couple of kids and a family and a mortgage to pay for, the big scary thing hovering over their heads is the cost of healthcare and then all the things that come with it. So one of the key aspects to get at this is not just what happens when you come down with a disease or a pathology and have to rush into the hospital to get something fixed. No, forget that. I say it's a much more intelligent idea to kind of start from the beginning with the quality of food they have access to in the first place. And by that, I mean, as you probably know, you go to a store, a major grocery store, whatever, and a lot of the stuff you see on the shelf, it looks nice, it looks pretty, and it was grown to look pretty. That's the whole point. These are genetically engineered things that looks nice on a shelf. They last longer. They have a nice color to them, etc. A lot of it's basically fake, or it's very heavily doctored to present itself as an advertisement as opposed to being a genuine food item. That's one topic. The other topic is we're really going to have to come up with a very different way of distributing access to what I call sort of an agribusiness environment that's not focused on giant centralized corporate-driven farming systems. I mean, for some crops, yes, that'll probably always be the case, but there's many crops where that's just a really bad mismatch. So I see a combination of quality of food, quality of life, much better management of resources like water and also energy, by the way, because what people don't know is when you drive by a big farm, what they don't see is the amount of energy it takes to run that farm. It's astonishing. Not just all the tractors and the machinery, but just the chemistry that's in the soil. The soil itself is inert. It's a dead material. It has to be constantly inoculated with mostly petrochemical-based nutrient enhancement to force the plants to grow so they can make the crop at the moment. In hydroponics, it's the exact opposite. The plants are not, trying to metabolize vast amounts of soil to get at these nutrients, or they don't have to be pumped full of really extremely magnified specific types of nutrients just to get them to grow at a certain rate to look nice. It's quite the opposite. It's almost like this is kind of a bad analogy, but it's kind of like hypodermic injection for plants. Because if you go into your typical hydroponic facility, like our research greenhouses here, the amount of roots that are grown, the ratio of root mass versus plant mass is quite astonishing. It's very small. And the reason for that is because the plants don't have to invest a lot of energy to get at the nutrients. They don't have to build a giant root system to feed the plant. In other words, they're feeding the plant quite nicely just as it is. So it can spend the vast majority of its actual photosynthetic energy on just growing the plant or growing the fruit in question, as it were. And furthermore, you can do this year round. It can be any time of year. You're not confined by geographical constraints. You're not confined by quality of soil. The water is recycled, so you're not throwing water into the soil and it disappears. And another piece of this puzzle that a lot of us maybe not have thought about. Excuse me, gosh, I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
There are these large, what are called dead zones in the ocean, and the dead zones are caused mainly by the runoff from these large sort of agro-corporate farms. And the reason for that is that, as I was saying just a few minutes ago, to force the plants to grow and produce their fruit or their stock or whatever you're trying to harvest, and they have to do it at a certain time frame so it comes to the market within the right season, all this kind of stuff. Okay, fine. So the way to get to that is to pump the soil full of all these nutrients, a lot of potash, potassium, phosphorus, and other materials that are used in this context. Well, the vast majority of this stuff is not used by the plant. It gets washed off, and the runoff ends up going to the oceans. That causes an algae bloom. I'm not kidding. You can see it from space. There's lots of pictures from satellites. Excuse me. And the algae then consume the oxygen, and you have entire regions like the size of states, big, giant areas, thousands of square miles, where you can put a submersible down, drive around under the water to see what's going on, and there's nothing down there. There's no fish, there's no seaweed, there's no plankton, there's no, crustaceans walking along the floor. It's just like dead. It's like a desert with water on top. And this has become a really serious problem. In fact, the largest dead zones now, it used to be off the coast of the United States and Gulf of Mexico. Now it's off the coast of Brazil because the direct correlation. You can see the numbers on that chart. It's startling how graphic it is. You look at the radical increase of these large sort of mega scale farms, and you look at the radical increase of the scale of these dead zones are off the coast of Brazil. It's like the lines are perfectly correlated. You can't possibly argue with the data. So it does kind of suggest that there's more to it than just, okay, we have to use a bunch of land and put a bunch of chemistries in there to make it grow a bunch of plants and then also use all these pesticides and everything else. It's that there's other sort of unexpected consequences, of which the dead zones in the oceans is one of. But the most major consequence that I'm focused on is the quality of the food itself. There's the material called flavonoids. It's one of the main sort of chemistry components of plants in general. But flavonoids are kind of the chemistry that are responsible for the way a plant tastes, or for the most part, it's different nuances of flavor. And interestingly enough, and this may be by design, who knows, but for the most part, when plants taste better, it also means they have a higher nutrient content. I mean, there's actually a real science for this. So we actually spend a lot of time at our lab doing exactly that. We specialize in if you go to our site, you can see we have quite a variety of different nutrient systems, both organic and
that's generalhydroponics.com.
That's generalhydroponics.com, yeah.
Okay, and we're getting really close to wrap this up, so I'm going to give you a few more minutes, and then we're going to have to wrap it up quick.
Have to vaporize into a different world.
Yes.
Okay, so the basic idea is this, that can one go into a small area of land, I mean a very small area, like maybe 1/10 to 1/5 the size that would take for a piece of open land inside of a building or on a rooftop, and use recycled water and have very precise control over exactly what nutrients are introduced to the plant, what is not introduced to the plant, and have a much shorter growing cycle, and therefore have to use a lot less in terms of pesticides and that kind of thing, and have a much more direct control over exactly what you're harvesting and when you're harvesting. In fact, you can harvest stuff. A lot of people that use our equipment, other people's equipment, actually have multiple crops at different stages, so they're constantly harvesting. In fact, in our major greenhouse, the largest labor cost is not in growing anything, it's in harvesting, because the plants grow so fast. I mean, we have strawberries and squash and melons, and we have a banana tree in there. We've got every kind of berry that exists almost. I mean, people send us stuff from all over the world saying, can you grow this? Put a root in the ground or a seed or whatever. And we haven't come across anything that we can't grow. We even have cactus growing. I'd probably believe it or not. So the point is this, that if you're looking at a way to rejuvenate, in many cases, really bad economic situation where there's virtually no growth or just very bad dispensation of resources, and you want to convert into a new kind of economic base, but at the same time raise the quality of health because of the quality of food involved, and actually get people who live there involved with their own local economy. This is like a big piece of the puzzle. When you have these giant corporate entities start taking over vast amounts of land and kind of running things from some distant foreign office, that's a complete different world than when you have the local community actually connected to the thing that they produce and the local economy, as it were. These things are very solvable. And, hydroponics isn't the end-all of end-alls, but it's certainly a piece of that puzzle.
Right, it's a start.
And so, yeah, it's a start, exactly. And so what's interesting is just in the past 8 or 10 years, cities all over the world, Japan, by the way, is very big on this, especially after Fukushima, but you find it in Korea, even in China now. You certainly find it all over Northern Europe and in various parts of the U.S. So I'm kind of on a mission here. I'm not even interested in selling my company stuff. That's not my thing at all. I'm not a sales guy, but I am really big on the idea of getting this concept to be more accepted. And it's happening. You find now some of the major cities in the U.S., Chicago even, and New York certainly, and other major cities have actually put up public funds, public-private partnerships to actually fund these kinds of research projects. And it turns out they work.
Excellent. And Charles, we have about 2 minutes plus or minus left. We're getting real close here. But I did want to thank you so much for being on tonight. It's been awesome to have you here.
Oh, it's always fun to be here. You're interesting company. So
yeah, I'm interesting.
It's always a good virtual date. What can I say?
Oh, yeah. No, I really appreciate you being on tonight. We had a lot of good information. And also now your website's generalhydroponics.com and also historianofthefuture.com.
That's correct.
Okay.
Although I must confess, I haven't really done much of the Historian of the Future for the last couple of years. I'm sort of overdue for a major update. But my thing is, people often poke at me and say, well, Charles, you need to be publishing more stuff. And the thing is, no, I work in the lab all day long.
Yeah.
I don't have a lot, I don't want to say this too harshly, but for some of the folks that are like big on the PR thing and they publish all this stuff all the time, it's probably because I'm not really doing that much work. Well, sorry, I'm actually doing stuff with my hands and building equipment and running experiments.
Exactly.
I don't have a lot of time. So.
Yeah, that's understandable, and we certainly appreciate you being on tonight for sure. And I do want to thank everybody for tuning in this evening. I hope you appreciated the show. And stay tuned for Researcher on a Mission with Dr. J coming up next, of course, on the Dark Matter Radio Network. And I want to make sure everybody has a good Thanksgiving as well. Is there anything else you want to leave us with here? We've got just a little bit of time in the illusion of time left.
The illusion of time.
30 seconds.
Yes,
30 seconds.
Yeah, that's the illusion of time. Time is a very fluid medium. I always appreciate being on your show. You ask great questions, and I'm always happy to. I do my best just to offer information. I'm not selling anything, but I love the idea of getting people to think and just to stimulate. Even if you don't agree, it's okay. The idea is to get those neurons firing, to get the buzz going. And, I'll be happy to answer. People want to send an email or something, that's fine. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm just here to kind of show a concept and see if people find it interesting. And hopefully it.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Charles. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, everybody. Take care.